Nathaniel Green.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, to be in Nathaniel Green's chosen town to live in. Probably of all the places he did live, this was the one place he chose to live, and unfortunately did not have much of an opportunity to be here. He spent about 4 years here before the war began, maybe 5. And the dream he and Katie had for living here and raising their family quickly came to an end. And they went into a world they never anticipated they would be part of. I saw these gentlemen over at the homestead before I came working on the siding, so they're busy over there all the time. I like to start my talks by saying that we all are fortunate to have hindsight to what these men accomplished in the American Revolution, and women. They never should have won. Period. End of story. And they pretty much knew that. This was seriously a David and Goliath story. And yet they believed in what they were standing up for with everything in them. With everything in them, willing to risk everything. And I like to just point that out so we get that feel right up front. We bask in what they accomplished. And we, as Americans, often forget of what it took to accomplish that. So General Nathaniel Green, how did I get interested in him? And I love to tell this story in case there are teachers in the audience. I was in 4th grade. My teacher said the first day of school, whoever reads the most books this year is going to get a prize at the end of the year. I love that idea. I came from a family of 10 children. We didn't get many prizes, you know? And my dad's favorite saying was, turn off the boob tube and read a book. So he was thrilled. I was reading all the time. I do not remember most of the books. I only remember one. It was called Johnny Tremaine by Esther Forbes. Anybody familiar with that classic child's book? And I don't remember what the prize was. But I remembered the characters that Esther Forbes put forth, and most of them I would continue to hear about throughout my formal education, except for 2 of them, who I'm not talking about tonight, but I've also written about them, Dr. Joseph Warren and Josiah Quincy Jr. Now, you'd think growing up in the town of Quincy, Massachusetts, I would have known who Josiah Quincy Jr. was, but no, So when I was finishing up my research on Warren, and it would take me frequently to Bunker Hill because that's where he died. And there was a quote up there at Bunker Hill, probably still is, I don't know. But it was a quote, let's sell them another hill at the same price. And I was finishing up my Warren, and when you're writing about an individual and kind of researching them for years on end, you feel like they are part of you. So I read that quote and I thought, what a jerk, because Warren died there. And it was General Nathaniel Green. And I thought, I gotta look into this guy a little bit more. And as I started looking into him, basically, his story was as inspiring and extraordinary as Warren's. In fact, it was almost as if Warren handed him the torch and Green went forward with it. Okay, now here we have a picture of the general before he was a general. Probably this is how he looked when he lived at the homestead, okay? And also let me throw this in here quickly, then we'll get on with it. I don't know if any of you have been to the homestead. You absolutely need to do that living in Coventry, and I get it. I grew up in Quincy, and most of my family has never seen the homes of John Adams or John Quincy Adams. Okay, I get it. I drag them every year, all right? And, but also you have the birthplace of Nathaniel Green over in East Greenwich, and that home has been owned by the Green family since 1686. It's pretty amazing as well. So, Nathaniel Green is a Quaker. He's a Quaker in 1774. No military training, nothing. But he developed a passion for what the Patriots were standing for. He would frequently go into Boston because even though his father was a very strict Quaker and didn't see much need for an education in his 8 sons, okay, 8 sons, no daughters here, and these sons worked in the iron forges that the father had and other businesses the Greens owned. These guys made anchors for ships and the chains that held those anchors. These guys were not scrawny, okay? They started yay high in those forges. Thank God they were Quakers, because you wouldn't want to get one of them angry and meet them in a back alley, okay? So Nathaniel craved an education, and even though the father didn't see the need beyond reading, writing, a little arithmetic, he allowed Nathaniel to have more of an education because Nathaniel was kind of going to deal with the business aspect of the green businesses. So he would frequently go into Boston in regard to the businesses as well. And he would go to, we'll get back to the Kentish Guards in a moment, he would go to a bookstore in Boston that was owned by a man named Henry Knox. Anybody recognize that name? Okay, Henry Knox was a bookseller. He had no military experience, and he and Greene became fast friends before the American Revolution. And of course, the British were occupying Boston for a period of time. So when Nathaniel would go in there and talk to Henry about purchasing some books, because he purchased books all the time, and he used to sneak them home. Mom and Dad were Quakers, and the kinds of books he loved were on military histories. Uh-oh. And he would sneak them into a room above the kitchen where nobody went. They just stored things there, and he would read his books up there. And some of these books he got from Henry Knox. Now, Nathaniel was 28 before he left home, okay? I mean, that was the norm, right? So Henry would tell him what books the British were ordering. The British soldiers. And Nathaniel would get some of those, reading the same stuff as these officers, why not? And he educated himself through these books, never knowing why he had this passion. He was still a Quaker. He never envisioned himself to be a major general in an army, for goodness sake. He just had a desire to learn this stuff. So he would bring these books home. And then he became involved with a militia unit that was beginning to form called the Kentish Guards out of Kent County, right? And it was just forming, and Nathaniel would smuggle out of Boston, with the help of Henry Knox to some degree, muskets, okay? He even smuggled out a British drill sergeant who was deserting the British Army, and he smuggled him out so he could train the Kentish Guards. Anybody here from the Kentish Guards? Okay, I'll feel free to talk. So anyway, when they decided that they were going to appoint the officers in the Kentish Guards, they didn't want to give Greene an appointment. He had been read out of the Society of Friends for joining. He had helped form them in a big way, but you know what? He had a limp. And they thought that was unbecoming of an officer, so they weren't going to give him a commission. Now, Nathaniel Greene wrote in a letter that he was mortified over it. He put all this work into it, but it didn't stop him from stepping into the ranks as a private. And we know this because when the Battle of Lexington and Concord occurred, the 3 militia units from Rhode Island were on their way to Massachusetts to help. And they were turned around before they got into Massachusetts by the governor. But a couple of people saw Nathaniel Greene marching as a private and put it in their journals. So we have that to document that he indeed did do that. They came back to Rhode Island because the governor of Rhode Island wanted to appoint a commanding officer over the different units going from Rhode Island. And the General Assembly met for almost a week. We don't have any of the writings pertaining to these meetings. My understanding is they were destroyed. But what we do know, when they finished, Nathaniel Greene went from private to brigadier general literally overnight. And thank God he did. Now, his take on it was, he did have a sense of humor. He said they tried to give it to the Congregationalist, he turned it down. They tried to give it to the Baptist, he turned it down. So they gave it to the newly fallen Quaker, okay? So here you have this man, no military background whatsoever except from books. And I love when kids are in the audience. I really emphasize that, okay? So he takes the Rhode Island units into Massachusetts, sets up his encampment, and if you read the stories of some of the generals later on, Henry Knox would be one of them that would say he came in the rawest of generals, but he became the most magnificent of the generals. Washington was so impressed with Greene because he greeted him in proper military protocol. His units were set up better than any of the other militia units that were there, and they became instant friends. He became Washington's confidant. Washington did not like to have Greene any distance from him. He wanted to be able to call on him when he needed to talk to him or, get his input on things. They were the most intimate of friends. There is actually one letter, if you go through the 13 volumes of Nathaniel Greene's letters, there is one letter where George Washington writes to him and signs it, "Love, George Washington." Okay? And Nathaniel Greene's wife, Katie, would also become a favorite of the Washingtons. And at the end of talking about him, I hope to talk a little bit about her as well. So here he is, Brigadier General now of the Continental Army. He gets a commission from the Continental Congress. And the officers he's closest to would be up here. You see George Washington as a younger man, how he did look during the war. The Marquis de Lafayette, the child general, the boy general they referred to him as, okay? He came over when he was 18 years old and was a major general. You have Lord Stirling, William Alexander, the Lord of Stirling, and you have Henry Knox. Henry Knox also, no military background, book learning. He would become the commander of artillery in the Continental Army, okay? Other friends of his were Mad Anthony Wayne. If you know anything about Mad Anthony, it's a good name for him, okay? And then we have Alex Hamilton, who's been made famous by the play on Broadway, right? Alexander Hamilton. So these were Greene's intimate friends during the war. Now we go from the beginning of the war, and we're going to jump to the Battle of Brandywine Creek. I usually title my talk on Nathaniel Greene, Savior of the Continental Army. And we're going to talk about the 3 times that he actually, literally saved the army. And I'm going to say this to you now, and I want it to sink in. He's your native son, okay? You live in the town he chose to live in. Washington could not have accomplished what he accomplished if Nathaniel Greene wasn't there. Period. That's how important he was. That's how vital he was. And yet today, most Americans don't even recognize the name. The Battle of Brandywine Creek. By this time, Nathaniel Greene has been made a major general in the Continental Army, and he commands a division, roughly about 2,000 men. So Washington goes into this battle against the British, and he sends General John Sullivan's division in. John Sullivan was from New Hampshire, and he told Greene to keep his division, in reserve. So Greene wasn't expecting necessarily to fight that day. It was a hot September day, brutally hot, they said, around 90 degrees probably. These guys have wool coats on, carrying all this luggage, and the muskets themselves are about 10 pounds, for gosh sake, okay? So he's in reserve, gets word at 4 o'clock that afternoon that General Sullivan is in trouble. He is being decimated by the British. And Washington calls Greene to move his division to the aid of Sullivan, or he would be decimated with 2,000 Continentals. Nathaniel Greene, on that hot September afternoon, moved his division 4 miles in 45 minutes. I'm told it has never been repeated. 4 miles in the brutal heat in 45 minutes. And if he hadn't have done that to give aid to Sullivan so his division could retreat, the war may have ended right there. Anybody ever told you that before? No. A few months after that, the army goes into this valley called Forge, right? Valley Forge. Must have been a little comfort to Nathaniel. He knew about forges, right? So they go in there, and we all know the situation, don't we? We learned it throughout our schooling. We learned it in 5th grade, and in 8th grade, and in 10th grade. Valley Forge. The bloody footprints in the snow, remember? They were dying. They had no food. They had no supplies. And then a few months later, they go in December, they come out in June, and they face the British in battle at Monmouth Courthouse, and it's a draw. They face the mightiest army on the planet, and it's a draw. Oh, we know why. We were told why in 5th grade and 8th grade and 10th grade, weren't we? We were. The Baron von Steuben came, right? Oh, I skipped something there. I'll go back to it. The Baron von Steuben came and he drilled those troops and made them a true army. How do you drill dying men? We have this gap that it seems no historian wanted to step into and say, wait a minute, what happened? When they went into Valley Forge, the reason they were in the dire straits they were in was because the quartermaster general of the Continental Army had decided he didn't want to do his job anymore. He kind of just abandoned the post. That's why they weren't supplied. It's as simple as that. And that quartermaster general is none other than Thomas Mifflin, who would go down to be a great founding father. You look up a list of founding fathers, he's on it. Okay? So they go into Valley Forge, they have no supplies, no food, nothing. And a couple months after they're in there, both George Washington and the Continental Congress are pleading with Nathaniel Greene to take the post of Quartermaster General. Why? Because even while he was in Coventry living at the homestead and has that iron forge, he employed many, many men from the area. The family businesses employed many, many men from the area. And as I said, he dealt with the business aspects of much of that. So he had the wherewithal to maybe get things going. So he didn't want to be quartermaster general. He said in a letter, "Who's ever heard of a quartermaster general in the golden pages of history?" True. Do you know who the quartermaster general is today? Probably one of the most important positions in the Army, right? A quartermaster general has to deal with everything you can think, every imaginable thing you can think in the way of supplies. He needs to map out their routes where they're going to go to do battle and make sure there are supplies along the routes, make sure there are boats at the rivers. It's a 24/7 job. There's no rest. So he dug his heels in for a while. Finally, he gave in. He said he would become quartermaster general for 1 year, and that he would assign his own assistants. Congress said, yeah, of course. Thank you, General Greene. And he got supplies rolling into Valley Forge within 3 weeks' time, before von Steuben started drilling the troops. In fact, Nathaniel Greene helped to print the drill manual for von Steuben. Up until 2015, if you went on the website of the Valley Forge National Historical Park, Nathaniel Greene's name wasn't even mentioned. You go in there, you would look up historical figures. Of course, Washington comes up, Lafayette comes up, von Steuben comes up, all these names come up. Then it even had a little thing, and I was hopeful, it said, more historical figures. Hit that, all kinds of names come up. Not Greene's. I gave this talk in 2011, was it? In Savannah, Georgia, to the National Society of the Sons of the Revolution. And they were so impressed with the story about Valley Forge that within 12 hours, they voted to raise the funds for a full-size bronze statue to be created and placed at Valley Forge. That's that statue, okay? It was a beautiful dedication ceremony. He's overlooking the fields where the men would have been encamped that he saved. The Quartermaster General of the United States of America gave the keynote address at the dedication ceremony. He's remembered there now. But now I challenge you, go home, go on their website, look up Nathaniel Greene. They'll have a little blurb, and it's kind of not a very, it kind of puts them down a little bit, actually. I've let them know how I feel about it, but anyway. So now we have this, and the guys here from the homestead will recognize this picture. It's at the homestead. This is Cornelia Lott Greene, the third child of Nathaniel and Katie Greene. She was conceived at Valley Forge. And I just always love looking at this because, I mean, it's right there, an actual picture of somebody that was conceived at Valley Forge. I love it, and I always show it. Okay. So here Greene, the Battle of Brandywine Creek, saved the Army. He saves the Army at Valley Forge. Washington was writing to Congress and talking about having to disband the Army if something doesn't happen. Well, the thing that happened was Nathaniel Greene. So he's Quartermaster General at the end of the year that he agreed to serve in that post because he was a battlefield commander, okay? At the end of the year, Congress doesn't want to relieve him of the post. And the other generals are kind of resenting the fact that if there's a battle, he can step in and take command because he's been out of touch with the troops and they just didn't feel that was fair after a year's time. So Greene's not happy. He got it up and running. He did everything he was asked to do and more so. And he is in constant communication with the Continental Congress, folks, because he's trying to supply this army that's always in need of supplies. He talks in his letters about he and Washington going to see Congress. And in one of the letters, he says there were 17 tables overladen with food, while the men back at camp were getting by on rations. He talks about the suits of the congressmen, the beautiful woolen suits they have, while he and Washington are missing buttons on their vests. And he let those in Congress know in the ooey gooey sticky, verbiage of the day in his letters, that they needed to supply the army and that they needed to find a means to get the money to supply the army. Congress declared independence, but it had not been obtained yet, folks. He made enemies in Congress. First one was John Adams, and I get to say this. I get to say this because I was born and raised in Quincy, Massachusetts, okay? He and John Adams were good friends. They wrote to each other all the time. Nathaniel Greene actually suggested to John Adams months before the Declaration of Independence that Congress needed to come up with the Declaration of Independence. We're on the field fighting, guys. Come on, right? Well, then some things started happening. One of the things was that Congress was taking foreign officers and giving them high commissions, such as major generals. And some of those officers were excellent. Thank God we got them. Lafayette, von Steuben, we could go with a list of them. But some of them weren't that good, okay? And there was this one French officer they brought over, and John Adams was on the committee that was giving commissions to these officers. In fact, he headed up that committee, okay? And they were going to give this French officer the position of Chief of Artillery, Major General. Henry Knox had been dealing with the artillery since the beginning of the war, and they never would promote him beyond a colonel, even though everybody was asking why they wouldn't. So now they're going to bring this foreigner in who's not fighting for the same reasons Henry Knox is fighting for. Not only are they going to replace Henry with this guy, they're going to make his position supersede that of Greene and Sullivan, who were both division commanders. So Greene, Sullivan, and Knox wrote letters to the committee and said basically, this isn't right. George Washington did too, as a matter of fact, said this isn't right. And Greene and Sullivan said, if you do this, we are going to leave the Army. We're going to resign our commissions. Well, John Adams didn't like that. John Adams was an amazing man. If he was on the antidepressants, I can only imagine what he would have accomplished, because he was a very depressed man. But John Adams was a narcissist. If you read his journals beyond his letters to Abigail, okay, he picks at everybody. He picks at and puts down everybody, okay? So John Adams was very upset that they were challenging him. They were being insubordinate to Congress. And John Adams cut off communication from Greene from that day on. First, they told these generals that they needed to apologize. They didn't. They ended up making Knox a general. They assigned this French guy to another place altogether. He didn't supersede Greene or Sullivan. They couldn't do without them. But yet they wouldn't listen to them either, okay? So that was one enemy he made in Congress. And time goes on, and he's talking to Congress about supplying the Army, and all the while they're resenting that he keeps bringing this up. Why does Greene keep bringing up supplying the Army? Well, it might have been because it was his job as Quartermaster General. I don't know. Nothing new under the sun, folks? So they actually get so upset with Greene for asking them to find the means to supply the Army that was facing death and destruction every day for this independence that they hadn't obtained, that they had a hearing to discharge Greene from the Army. It's about 2 years after he's Quartermaster General. And George Washington gets word they're going to have this hearing in Congress, and he sends word to all the congressmen that had been in the Army prior to, who understood the state of the Army, to defend him. And after 4 days of the hearings, they decided they were going to relieve Greene of the command as Quartermaster General, get another quartermaster to take his place, and he would be battlefield commander again. So thank God, thank God. Now this same Congress, folks, isn't all our education in school about the Congress when we talk about the American Revolution? Right? This same Congress, a few months later, were begging and pleading for Washington to assign Greene as commander of the Southern Campaign. Southern Campaign, Northerners don't know so much about it. When I speak in the South, they know what happened down there, and they know the name of Nathaniel Greene down there. 2 generals had been assigned the command down there. Well, let me back it up for a minute. the war turned to the south. The British figured if they could gain control of the south, then they could gain control of the rest of the states. George Washington could not move the main army from the middle states to the south, knowing full well that as soon as he did that, the British would just sail up to the middle states and come in there. So he had to have the middle states covered with the main army. He had a small army in the northern states, and he had the southern army. And 2 generals had gone down there and had failed rather miserably, okay? The first one ended up surrendering. The second one ended up retreating, General Gates, and he just kept retreating and retreating and retreating and retreating without his army, like 200 miles. So part of the thing Greene was supposed to go down and do was court-martial this general, but he didn't end up doing that. He had too much on his plate to do it. So he's assigned command of the South by the same Continental Congress that wanted to get rid of him just a few months before. He gets down there, and he finds he has 2,000 Continental soldiers. Half of them are sick, and all of them are poorly supplied. He took everything he had learned as quartermaster general to get supplies coming into this army because they were not equipped to face the British. The British were strong in the South. He got them up and running in no time. And then he realized he had to change tactics and strategies down there. He was not going to be able to use the same strategies and tactics that were used by the main army because the situation just was not the same. In the north, you had more patriots than Tories, more militia companies you could call on that would come fully equipped to aid the Continental Army. Easier sources of food. Down there, it just wasn't so. So his, well, let's first look at this. These are the actions of the South. He was down there for 2 years. These are all the actions he took. He had major battles, he had skirmishes, he had sieges. And in the meantime, Washington and the army had a time of repose, basically. Greene was facing it all. His tactics became that of retreat, basically. The British had their supplies in the deep South. Georgia, South Carolina, okay? So if he could pull British General Cornwallis away from his supplies, that would weaken him ultimately, right? So that's what he began to do. He would lure Cornwallis and the British Army onto the battlefield. He wasn't worried about winning the battle. He was just wanted to weaken Cornwallis. And then he would retreat and retreat and retreat. And ultimately, he got Cornwallis up to Virginia, didn't he? To Yorktown. But before he did that, we'll talk about another great situation he was involved in that is still taught at West Point. He was supposed to face the British in battle at a place called Guilford Courthouse. He had it all set up. He was supposed to get a large amount of militia to come and assist the Continentals that he had. The night before the battle, the British scared off the militia units. He went from 700 down to about 70 that were going to show up, and that just wasn't enough to face the British. No way. So he knew he was in trouble. So what he decided to do very quickly was retreat. But this wasn't going to be one of his average retreats. He was going to retreat about 100 miles from North Carolina into Virginia, cross a river called the Dan. to get his men to safety, regroup, and sit there for a while? No. He was going to regroup, he was going to get more supplies, more militia, and he was going to turn around and face the British immediately. 100-mile retreat, folks. The British were determined to get him. Cornwallis was determined to get this Iron Master. Cornwallis had his army burn their supplies. He burnt his own private supplies. He wasn't going to be weighed down. He was going to get this Rhode Islander. Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee, was head of one of his cavalry units, Greene's cavalry units, and he was in the rear guard throughout this whole march for 4 days. And he could see the front of the British forces the entire time. That's how close they are doing this, okay? They would maybe stop for a couple of hours, eat something, get some sleep. And if they did that, they knew the British were going to stop too because they were equally exhausted and equally hungry, all right? So there's one incident that some of his aides wrote about, that on this retreat, they were going to stop for a couple of hours, and the aides had found this old shack, this old cabin on the side of the road. And they were all happy that, you know, they had this shelter and there was actually a bed there. And not only was it Greene, but the governor of South Carolina was with them marching, John Rutledge. And so they told, you know, Your Excellency, which Greene was called in the South, okay, come, we have this house, come and lay down for a while, you and the governor. So they go into this house and Greene's exhausted. Now, maybe you don't know this, but Nathaniel Greene had asthma, okay? He was plagued with asthma. So they go into this house, they fall onto the bed, the general and the governor, and all of a sudden, Governor Rutledge yells out, "General, stop moving!" And Greene, equally as irritable, says, "It's not me, it's you, Governor." They both jump out of the bed because neither of them says they're moving. And the aides come over and pull the blankets back, and there's a wild pig under the blankets. Now, mind, Greene was nervous about the dust being stirred up because of his asthma, right? So the aides open the door, the wild pig runs out the door, they all fall down where they are because they're so exhausted and fall asleep, and nobody really knows if it was a hallucination or not. That's how exhausted. This retreat and then back again to face the British took weeks. Nathaniel Greene and his men never took off their clothing for weeks. This wasn't playing army. This was the real thing. He takes his army off. The British think he's going to go to the the shallowest part of the river to cross. That's what they're figuring. Well, Greene's not going to do what they're figuring. He takes his army off to the deepest part of the river, tells Harry Lee to, lead them another way, so they think the entire army is going that way, but they're not. He gets his men over that river, even Harry Lee and his cavalry, all the horses, nobody was hurt whatsoever. They made it across that river. He went to see the governor of Virginia. He needs cavalry horses. Their horses are worn out. He needs supplies. He needs a supplied militia from Virginia. He's telling all the governors down in the South, send me your militia supplied. I do not have the means to supply them. I can barely supply the army. This governor had already sent his militia to Greene at one point with no supplies whatsoever, no food, nothing. Greene turned them around and sent a letter rebuking the governor for what he had done. Now he goes into this state and goes to the governor and says he needs some horses for his cavalry. He needs some supplies. He's going to turn around and face the British in battle. And that governor said to him, well, you know, what if the British come up here? What if they come up here? I'm going to need my militia. I'm going to need my supplies. I'm going to need my horses. God bless you, General Greene. Go back. Go face the British. British did go into Virginia later. They took the supplies and they took the horses and they fought against Greene with them. Let that sink in, folks. We are now 7 years into the war. The Declaration of Independence. Yay. It had not been obtained yet. And we're not going to supply the army that's in that field. I don't think Tommy liked Nathaniel very well after that. Nathaniel would write to his friends up north. One of his statements was, oh, this was to members of Congress, even better. There are few generals that have run oftener or more lustily than I have done, but I have taken care not to run too far and commonly have run as fast forward as backward to convince our enemy that we were like a crab that could run either way. Weaken them, weaken them, weaken them. Take them from their supplies. He also wrote this: we fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. He led Cornwallis into Virginia and dumped him there at Yorktown. Knowing Lafayette was there with his troops, von Steuben was there with his troops, and George Washington was on his way with the strength of the French. He set it up and turned around immediately. There were still British in Charleston and Savannah, and if he didn't lay siege to them, they would only get reinforced and it would start all over again. He set up the Battle of Yorktown and had no part in it and got no credit for it. No credit for it. And the war ended, right? Yay. Down south, they know it didn't end there. Greene went down. He laid siege, had skirmishes, all kinds of things going on for another full year after Yorktown. And he was trying to supply his troops the whole time. Always, always, always begging for supplies. The people down south got tired of the army laying siege. And they wanted them gone, but he didn't have his orders to send them off yet, right? Not until the British evacuate the South completely. And we had a financier of the war, a congressman that would oversee the finances being given to the Army or the Navy to support them, right? To get supplies, right? That's how it works. And his name was Robert Morris. Now, why Robert Morris didn't like Nathaniel Greene, I haven't figured it out yet. But it seems he didn't like him. How do we know this? There was a biography written about Nathaniel Greene. It was printed in 1822 by a Supreme Court justice named William Johnson. He was from South Carolina. And he is so close to when the war ended, he said in his 2-volume biography on Greene that there were still people in the South that resented Greene. Why? Because Greene wanted the governors of the southern states to allow slaves to join the Continental Army and earn their freedom in return. And they didn't let that happen. And people resented him even in 1822. For even making the suggestion. Then Greene, of course, being a Quaker with that Quaker background, he thought that after the war that we should welcome the Tories back into the fold. That resenting the Tories, holding them at arm's length was not going to heal the nation, and we needed to work at healing the nation. A lot of people didn't like that idea. We have that today, don't we, with Democrats and Republicans? You know? So they didn't like him. And this Supreme Court justice was writing this. But the other thing he wrote was this. He stated that John Marshall, who was the chief of the Supreme Court, in his biography on George Washington in 1805, had written that Robert Morris, who was a close friend of Chief Justice Marshall, but now he's dead when he's writing this biography, okay? That Robert Morris had purposely held funds back from Nathaniel Greene when he was commanding the South. I was horrified. I actually didn't see that till a couple of years ago, and I was horrified that he had an agent down there, according to Johnson's biography, that would watch Greene and report things. And until his back was against a wall, monies would not be released. So in that last year of the war, monies weren't being released. And Nathaniel Greene had to supply his men. And the merchants, it's a long story that I'm happy to answer questions, involved story, but I'm going to give you the snippet of it, okay? So Greene was told by the merchants in the South that unless he signed his name on the dotted line saying he was legally responsible for paying back these merchants for these supplies for his troops, they wouldn't give him the supplies. Greene had no choice. He's got a standing army in the South. He's a major general, commander of the Southern campaign. Of course the Continental Congress is going to pay this. Of course they are. And he signed his name. He signed with his, I'm left-handed, he signed his name. The British evacuated the South. Greene headed north. When he got up to where the main army was and spent a few days with his friends, resigned his commission before Congress, no fanfare, no great thanks for him. And he was also told that no, they were not going to honor the payment of the merchants. The Continental Congress was not going to pay the debt, leaving Greene with this enormous debt. So there's a famous painting of Washington's farewell to his officers. Nathaniel Greene was not there. They begged him to stay for a couple of weeks until the British evacuated New York and the war was absolutely over. And Greene said to them, "No, I have a family in Rhode Island that I dearly love." And he came home. He was done with it. He couldn't stay here. His brothers, as I said, he had a lot of brothers and they had large families and they couldn't support his family as well at this point. He had been given lands down south as thanks for his service, as were other generals. And he was given land. North Carolina gave him 25,000 acres. Whoa, huh? It was on their frontier land. It was of no value to him. His children, two of his daughters ended up moving there, but it was of no value to him. Today it would be of value. It's near Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, yeah. But then South Carolina gave him a plantation, 2,500 acres, that had been abandoned by a Tory. It was in good shape. It was really in good shape. He sold it. He needed money quickly to pay the debtors. Savannah, Georgia gave him a plantation as well, 2,500 acres, not in as good shape as South Carolina was, but he moved his family there. And he tried to get started there. His rice crop was well, before we talk about his rice crop, he ended up purchasing quite a number of slaves to run the plantation, which I'm sure, as a Quaker, added a lot of stress to him. He would work the fields with them. He treated them like family. In some of his letters, you can see that. He had a good rice crop coming in, so he was feeling good. He could pay some of the debt. And then a storm came through and blew it all away. So one day, he needed to go into Savannah, the town, and this is Mulberry Grove, the Mulberry Grove plantation. That's what the house looked like at the time. Today, if you go in there, all is left is the brick stairs, kind of laying there. So he went into Savannah to see his attorney and one of the merchants that was demanding payment. And it was a stressful meeting. And add on top of this stress, folks, a little tidbit here that one of the man that lived in Savannah, his name was James Gunn. James Gunn was a militia captain from Georgia, cavalry. And at the end of the war, General Greene had to put certain orders out to the army, and one of the orders was if you have one of the army's horses, you cavalry officers, you have to turn it in. It's federal property. Well, James Gunn didn't like that order. He didn't like it at all. And he challenged Nathaniel Greene to a duel over it. Now, come on, guys. Some of you brought your tanks home from the army, right? So Nathaniel Greene actually wrote a letter to George Washington about this situation because he was not going to turn up for this duel because he figured it would set a precedent that any soldier that was upset with a commanding officer could now challenge him to a duel. And Washington agreed with him, and he didn't, but he carried pistols with him everywhere he went because he didn't know if James Gunn was going to be out in the street and kill him. A little bit more stress in his life, right? So he went to this meeting with his attorney, and this man demanding payment. They headed home. Katie was with him, his wife. And on the way home, he wanted to stop by a neighboring plantation where that plantation owner had a really good crop of rice coming in, and he wanted to talk to him about how he did it. And he kind of walked around that plantation for a couple of hours. It was June. It was hot. It's down in Savannah, Georgia. He didn't wear his hat. But come on, this guy had commanded in the South for 2 years. Not like he wasn't used to the heat, right? Well, Katie's visiting the wife the whole time. Then he's done. They get in their carriage to go to their Mulberry Grove. And on the way, he's not feeling well. He tells her he's not feeling well. He has a headache. They get home. He's still not feeling well. Now, a nightly visitor to their dining room table was Mad Anthony Wayne. He served under Greene in the South, General Wayne, and he was given a plantation right next to General Greene's, which is called Richmond, the Richmond Plantation. And Anthony Wayne's a single guy, and he likes to flirt with Katie. All the guys like to flirt with Katie. Didn't bother Nathaniel in the least, okay? So Anthony comes over, and General Greene's just not well at all. And finally takes to his bed. They're calling doctors in to do the typical stuff the doctors did back then, blister and bleed, okay? He falls into a stupor, which is a semi-coma, and within 4 days he's dead. The doctors said it was heat stroke. Anthony Wayne didn't believe that for a second. He thought it was a stroke brought on by the hardships of the war, especially the Southern campaign, and the abandonment of Congress. Nathaniel Greene, folks, was 44 years old. He left his wife, Katie, with 5 small children and the enormous debt. Fell right onto her. He was buried in Savannah. He was put in a borrowed tomb at first and then moved to Johnson Square in Savannah. If you ever go down there, there's a big monument. And here's, Thomas Sumter was another enemy. We'll talk about him in just a second now. So, Katie Greene has the debt now, and 5 young children, and a plantation. When George Washington became president, remember I told you that Nathaniel and Katie were favorites of the Washingtons, both of them, Martha and George, okay? Katie would have been about the age Martha's daughter would have been. She had died. George went on his southern tour as president, and he stopped at the Mulberry Grove plantation to visit the Widow Green. And when he was coming back north, he stopped at the Mulberry Grove plantation to visit the Widow Green. Now, many historians will tell you that's because they were having an affair. See the size of that house? 5 children, a tutor, servants. Not really too many spaces to go hide out, right? And I'm going to throw the side note in here because I'm getting pretty disgusted by it. Any shows you see on TV nowadays about the American Revolution or that time period, and many of our historical books that are coming out now, love to talk about sex. Anybody see that one on the spies and what was that called? Yeah, Turn. Falling into bed, left, right, and center. Folks, it was a dangerous thing to have a baby back then. It was a terribly scary thing to have a baby back then. They weren't falling into bed left, right, and center. Okay? When George Washington went back to New York, he talked to the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who was also a good friend of the Greens. And Alexander Hamilton drew up a 20-page petition for Congress to pay off the debt for the Widow Green. Do you think maybe President Washington was counseling Katie Green, his good friend, about how to approach Congress? And do you think he was going to step out and tell all the newspaper reporters, what were you doing there, General President? Oh, I was counseling her. Well, he couldn't say that, could he? She went before Congress with the help of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and Congress fought for 4 days over it, and she won by a very narrow margin. Why? Because Thomas Sumter was a congressman. He had been a militia general under Greene, but he didn't like getting orders from another general. He resented that, and he had an attitude towards Greene. They had a falling out. Well, Sumter doesn't like Greene, and he's going against Katie. Another congressman, James Gunn, the guy that wanted the tank, okay? She ended up winning in the end. Now, we'll talk a little bit about Katie because a lot of writers have really, really gone after her. There was a biography written about her in the 1970s. And in that biography, there is a snippet of a letter from Nathaniel to Katie. And he's admonishing her in this snippet of a letter, okay? And the biographers took this and, blew it up, saying that he was admonishing her because she was drinking too much wine. She was becoming fond of wine. She was becoming an alcoholic. She was a party animal alcoholic. Well, at the same time, the letters of Nathaniel Greene are coming out in 13 big, thick volumes, okay? And when you got hold of that entire letter to his wife, he is admonishing her because she just had a baby and he thinks she's overdoing. It's a little bit different, isn't it? I told you she liked to flirt. She was raised by her father, brothers, and uncles. Her mother died when she was young on Block Island. She was very comfortable in the presence of men. Nathaniel Greene's military family loved when she would come to camp in the winter because she would liven everything up and play jokes with them and their antics join in. The other generals, the family was silent because the wives came. They had to behave themselves, but not with Katie. Not with Katie. Did that make her evil? Oh, then there's this one, okay? We know when she left her husband in the South. She went down for the last year of the war to spend with her husband. And we know when she left because he wrote it in a letter, right? And she was to sail to New York and then go back to Rhode Island to the children who were left in Rhode Island with family. And he was going to come by land back. So she got to New York by herself, spent a few days in New York with her friends, then went on to Rhode Island. And when he gets back to Rhode Island, lo and behold, she's pregnant. Well, every time Katie came to visit him, she ended up pregnant, okay? So she's pregnant. So now we're going to start doing the math. She left him on this day. And when does he say she has the baby in his letters? Oh my God, it's 44 weeks after she left him. Obviously, she was sleeping with the other officers. Wasn't his kid. I don't know if it's because I'm a woman. I don't know what it is. I'm a nurse. I don't know. I sat down 2 obstetricians, and I said, look, these are the facts. Can a woman go 44 weeks? Both of them pulled out, the ladies will know this, you know the wheel where they determine your due date? They put the wheel in front of me. They said, Janet, the wheel has 44 weeks on it. We just don't let women go that long anymore. So it very well could have been his baby. Can we say it for a fact? No. But he didn't seem to be upset by it. A man back in that day, hearing all the gossip even then about Katie Green, went to interview her and ask her questions. He heard that they were getting divorced. He heard this, he heard that. And he walked away from that interview and said, basically, she's a woman who knows herself, and she just lives her life. There's nothing scandalous here. And Nathaniel Green was a man who accepted that she was a woman who knew herself. She was a woman ahead of her time. That did not make her evil, an adulteress, or any such thing. So just to set all that straight, okay? And that kind of got away from Nathaniel, but Major General Nathaniel Green, the forsaken commander of the Southern Campaign, the forsaken commander of the entire war. Why didn't Valley Forge remember him? Why didn't we hear these stories? Washington would not have accomplished what he accomplished without Nathaniel Green. The South would have been lost. 2 generals had already tried and failed. They would have been lost at Valley Forge. They would have been lost at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. Why don't we hear about Nathaniel Green? And could it be because men in powerful places were challenged by him, and they went on to write the history? I challenge you now, go home, look up a list of founding fathers. 99% of them are politicians, folks. Washington and Hamilton make the list because they became politicians, right? Henry Knox. Anyone that served on the front lines of that war and didn't go into politics is not considered a founding father. That's just disgraceful. The casualties of the Continental Army, tens of thousands. Casualties of the Continental Congress, 0. We need to start teaching our kids the entire story. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Any questions or comments? Yes.
I noticed you had the image on there with Katie and the
Eli Whitney.
But you didn't mention it at all. When I was touring in Savannah, they thought well of the Greens down there.
Yeah, they do. They do and they don't. I've been down there when... Well, not that they don't think well of him, but they don't know. I was standing at his gravesite down there, and a tour bus is going by, and they're asking, oh, who was he? Oh, I don't know. It's like, what do you mean you don't know? But, Katie Green, actually, after Nathaniel died, they had a tutor that came down with them to Savannah. His name was Phineas Miller. And he kind of took over a lot of the duties of the plantation after Nathaniel died. And he had a friend who was also a tutor and was hired by a family in Savannah. But then when he came down from Connecticut, I believe, the family said they didn't need him anymore, and he had nowhere to go. So Phineas Miller asked Katie Green if maybe they could put him up, give him odd jobs, that type of thing. So she said, yeah, sure. So they did, and he liked to invent little trinkets and little things around the house, and so that was a lot of fun. And then he had this big project he was working on, and one night he approached Katie Green and Phineas Miller about it, and he said he was at an impasse, and he just didn't know what to do. He said, I don't know how to separate the seeds from the cotton. His name was Eli Whitney. Now, what happened was Katie ran over to the fireplace, and she got the hearth brush, and she showed Eli Whitney that if he put it on this little invention in a certain angle, it would pull the seeds off. Her name is on the patent of the cotton gin. And the original cotton gin was at Mulberry Grove. The foundation is still there. Mulberry Grove is an amazing place, because it was burnt down during the Civil War, and nobody has ever gone in to do anything. I mean, things are just laying on the ground. Old wine bottles from that time period. I mean, you know, the horseshoes laying there, and it's amazing. So this was an active plantation that just died, and nobody's ever gone in to check it out. It's a pretty amazing place. And the Georgia Ports Authority now owns the property, and it's like an act of God to get in there. You have to get special permissions, and they take you in armed. They send a couple of security guards with you with guns, and it's kind of freakish, but it should be turned into a museum, quite honestly. It should be turned into a museum. Not only is the foundation of the cotton gin there, but this fantastic general lived and died there. George Washington visited there, yeah. Anything else? Yes?
Why has nobody done anything, any archival, any archaeological work?
Because the Georgia Ports Authority kind of restricts things. But there is a group down there called the Mulberry Grove Foundation that has been trying to get permission to go in and do that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So you had mentioned when we get to Mulberry Grove that he purchases slaves.
Mm-hmm.
I was always under the impression that when he gets there, they were kind of with the property. There were some letters that spoke about him having like this internal fight because he, you know, was moving to Mulberry Grove and it's kind of the workforce at the time, and now he has to manage that. Where did you come up with this? He purchased.
There is a letter where he talks about having to purchase more, probably, yeah. Yeah, that he has to.
The 13th book of his letters?
Yeah, the last volume, yeah, uh-huh. And you have to understand, too, at the same time, you know, because people have asked me, did he believe in slavery? What were his thoughts on slavery? Raised as a Quaker, probably not. Probably he was very opposed to it, but he hung around with people like George Washington for a long time, who had no problem with slavery, right? And a lot of Southerners. But at the same time, Lafayette was very opposed to slavery, very opposed to it. And he was devising a way to help the slaves to adapt to freedom and wanted to put that into practice in the United States. And he was actually corresponding with George Washington about doing this. So there was this momentum, and that would have been Greene's, had he lived, his tie too with Lafayette. I mean, after Greene died, his oldest son, George Washington Greene, the generals fought over who was going to educate him. Henry Knox, Lafayette, and George Washington were basically fighting over, you know, taking on the responsibility. And it ended up that Lafayette took him. So young George Washington Greene went to France and lived with Lafayette and was educated over there. Lafayette also had a son about the same age who was also George Washington, okay? But then when the uprising started happening in France, he sent young George Washington Greene back to Savannah. And within a few weeks' time, tragically, he went out on the river on a boat with a friend, and the boat capsized and he drowned. So he ended up being buried with his father. So you can only imagine Katie Greene dealing, with all of this, with all of it. And when she would go to camp every winter to visit him. And she would always take George Washington Greene with her. He was a favorite of all the officers, and of course, George Washington and Martha Washington. And there were periods of time, like the Southern Campaign, where Nathaniel Greene did not see his children for more than 2 years' time. I mean, he may have seen them as infants and then didn't see them again. So a really difficult life. Yes.
Did Rochambeau have any dealings with Greene?
They knew they did, but not down south so much. He wanted the French Navy to come to his aid because after Yorktown, there were rumors that the British were going to reinforce down south in Savannah and Charleston. And he was terrified. The numbers he was hearing were like 3,000 reinforcements, and he just didn't have the strength to face that. So he was sending word to Washington. Of course, folks, you don't have a cell phone, right? You don't have email. It's weeks and weeks before you get a message back telling Washington basically he was desperate. He needed reinforcements. Washington did send some men down, but not a large amount because he was fearful of what might happen again in the Middle States. So Greene asked that the French Navy come down and block the British from dropping off these reinforcements. And they said no, that they had to go refit their ships and then they had to go to the West Indies or something, and they weren't going to be able to help him. In the end, it ended up being only a handful of reinforcements, but Greene was, for a while, terrified over the possibility, yeah. He made peace, I think, with the French after the Battle of Rhode Island, when Sullivan kind of blew up at them. You guys probably know that more than me. And he made peace with the French, and then he went over to the Congress in Rhode Island to try to calm them down because Sullivan had stirred things up quite a bit. So, yeah, he was a peacemaker. Anything else? Yes.
I understand that there's a 13-volume edition of all of his letters and manuscripts?
Yep, all his papers. 13 volumes, and they're very thick. Yeah.
Do you have a copy of it at the...
Do you guys have a copy of it at the homestead? Yeah.
We do. We have a research library at the homestead that is open by appointment. So if you do call, we actually have all 13 books in the series. They were actually repenned by his grandson, George Washington Greene. So.
I wouldn't be surprised if some of the libraries here in Rhode Island have them also in their research, areas. Just because the Rhode Island Historical Society kind of set the papers in motion. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Yes.
Last question, Jen. Did Greene appeal directly to Washington when he's having trouble with Congress or with no Congress? Did he make a personal direct appeal to Washington in his letters?
When he was in the South or when he was quartermaster?
When he was in the South.
They frequently corresponded, so I can't tell you right now for a fact, but they were in constant as far as you can be constant that distance at that time, correspondence, yeah. But of course, Washington was looking for monies for the main army too, Anything else? Yes.
What was the percentage of Tories versus Patriots in the general population?
I don't know that do you guys have any answer to that? A third. But now in the North, it was more in the South less. You had more Tories in the South. And of course, the towns were spread out more in the South, so it made everything.
40 in the North and 40,
Maybe.
60 in the South?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it's usually looked at as a third of neutral, actually. Yeah. Tories and Patriots and neutrals. It's like a third.
Right. And then the militia weren't always stable, you know, in battle. They finally, down south, General Morgan came up with a plan to tell them to shoot twice and then they can leave. And they would get one shot out of them and then they'd run, because they tended, when they saw the British coming, because the militia were often on the front lines and the Continentals were behind them, and they would panic, as any of us would, I can only imagine. And so that they wouldn't tell them what was expected, just shoot, you know, you see the British shoot. And they would panic and very often didn't even get one shot fired before they would run. So down south, they devised a plan to tell them, okay, we only expect 2 shots from you. Then you can leave. We give you permission to leave. And then they would get at least their 1 shot out of them, yeah. Which helped. It helped weaken the British before they got to the Continentals. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.